if you agree if you agree that that your seminar will be recorded, is that okay for you?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, we can just start, or if someone, Thomas, I don't know if you want to say anything.
All right.
I'm muted. Yeah. Just to say welcome. I'm Thomas, the head of the group organizing this. Well, and now self-organized by students, but just want to welcome you and thanks for taking time. Students will slowly, I think, join because they come from very different latitudes. This is an international group, so we are all split across the world here, and it's going to be recorded and also AI summarized. In case you don't want it to be published later on, you can just let us know, but we keep it for our internal record. Okay? So thank you, Flor, for hosting the meeting, and I wonder if you will introduce him or self-introduce Sabin. So now the stage is all yours. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I can just start. I'll share my screen. Host disable participant screen sharing. I can't
Now
share
it's
yet.
possible. You can do it.
Can do it? Okay, cool. All right. So, right. Thank you for inviting me. And my name is Sabin Roman. I'm my background is in theoretical physics, and I did a peculiar PhD. Namely, I tried to model how societies collapse. And most recently, I was employed at the University of Cambridge, where I studied continued studying collapse and the Center for Study of Existential Risk. And I'm currently in Ljubljana at the Joseph Stefani Institute. So, what did I do in my work? I covered basically most cases of collapse where we have significant amounts of data. And I developed dynamical system models, so systems of differential equations, that describe the long-term evolution of relevant variables. And this depended on the society in question, but there are certain commonalities that come across in all these different cases. And this is what I'm going to highlight in the talk. But yeah, it draws upon quite a lot of work. So, societal collapse, a very optimistic topic. It's been an interest for a very long time, for hundreds of years. And the first book on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, written by Gibbon in the 1700s. And ever since then, there have been a lot of ideas, theories on what causes collapse. If you follow the literature, it's mostly qualitative insights. There hasn't been that much modeling done. And you can really wonder if there's been much progress. A funny thing that happens is often whenever there's a societal issue, like, I know, inequality or environmental change or whatever other aspect, scholars tend to project the current issues into the past, and it sort of forms a common pattern, but it doesn't necessarily inform the past in an unbiased way. So the question is, can we do better? Can we find some unified framework to understand how these happen? And generally, you could think of it like the more mature the science, the better the modeling. And mathematical modeling is fairly rare in the field. There's a fair amount of work done by economists on the topic, and I'll get into that a bit. But it's fairly rare because the data is scarce and sparse. And overall, given the entire history of the field, there's this apparent intractability of understanding it. Like, we're always stuck in this endless debate. And the situation is not unsimilar to the one in general science, specifically in physics. For thousands of years, we didn't know what was happening. And interestingly enough, our first scientific success did not come from understanding an earthbound phenomenon, but one that was at much larger scale over much longer time periods. And basically, our first predictive power came from Kepler's laws of planetary motion, and that was basically the first time we understood the solar system. and a physical system actually, and would have a predictive capacity. Now, the interesting thing here, why did it happen at the scale of the solar system? Why could not we predict like things earthbound? In retrospect, earthbound phenomena are affected by two forces, electromagnetism and gravity. If you zoom out, only one force becomes dominant, and that's gravity. And the situation actually simplifies. So in a sense, it's easier to see the forest than the trees. And this is the key insight that I sort of took an inspiration and um, it was basically the starting point of my work. Because otherwise, if you can't find a pattern that is consistent over centuries or millennia, then it's kind of hopeless to find a meaningful explanation for the long-term dynamics. So if such a force could exist, then this would simplify things. But it would be a force that operates in time and not in space like gravity. So if gravity is a dominant force over large spatial scales, what is the equivalent of gravity in a temporal sense that applies to societies or to social factors? Now, the way the results in the literature look like, and this is an early model done by two economists. Um, a common model in the literature focuses on Easter Island. So it's a nice example because it's a well-bounded system, and it makes sense to study it as a first case because it's also simple relative to other historical cases. So here, the problem that the model had was that they didn't actually compare their output with the available data at the time. So the model was done in the late 90s, and as you can see, there's sort of a visible mismatch. I improved on the model. I added additional dimensions and modified the structure. So that model was made based on economic assumptions. If you change these, you can have a much better fit while using the same parameters. So this was just a structural change. So the underlying assumptions were different. And I did a similar exercise for the Maya civilization. And this was a bit trickier because the data was separated by decades. And yet the same model explains both data sets. So, and the model is more complex than the Easter Island one, but again, pretty compact. So it does a remarkable job. And the Joseph Tainter, one of the world experts in the field, wrote a Nature review where he said the same thing, that it's really good. Now, the thing about all this modeling is you can be given some data, and people could say, "So what? You could fit anything to it. What does what does it matter? What can you actually learn?" So when modeling these, I noticed that literature has a lot of gaps, a lot of issues when it comes to it. It doesn't adhere to consistent criteria. And the first thing is historical fit. It actually needs to fit the best available data. And this was rarely done. Like I showed in the East Island model, the initial one by the economists, they didn't bother for whatever reason. Then there's also the issue of plausibility of underlying assumptions. So it's one thing to assume utility maximization in some ideal universe where you know everything, and another just to go with sort of basic ecological assumptions on how a species or people would interact with their environment. Similarly, the model structure, you want it to be meaningful. So each equation, each term, ideally should map somehow to the real world. And again, this is not always the case. And often, at least in the economics literature, you have a lot of elements introduced, a lot of over-parameterization. So they get new behavior by adding more parameters, but that behavior is not justified um, in reality. So this is a common thing that you see in the literature. Then there's the issue of calibration. Often models are done by fine-tuning, and this is a problem. Ideally, you'd like the model structure to be set, and then you read off the parameters from the literature. And this is all the models I developed were in this spirit. So it's a high bar in a way, because you're not trying to just to do an optimization of some parameters in a big model, like you do in a neural network, but you're actually trying to fit the structure of the model to fit reality as well as you can. And then hopefully the parameters also come from reality. Then there's also the matter of robustness. some models in the literature, specifically under Maya, have this sensibility to parameter changes. The ones that I developed don't. Like they're robust. The moment you change a parameter, you wouldn't expect a radical change in the output. Again, there's some exceptions there, but generally this is the criteria. There's the matter of diversity and flexibility. So you want the model to show a wide variety of behaviors, if possible, whatever is consistent with history. And also, it's a matter of communication. How the models tend to get overly complicated, and then it's hard to reproduce and also to convey. So these are a lot of the issues that you see in the modeling literature, and I try to sort of meet every criteria, because then I think you have a much more plausible structure. So, what about the two societies I showed, the Easter Island and the Maya? In that case, you can actually learn something from the equations, and both of them have a similar causal structure. So here you see the population is harvesting resources and it's producing some benefits from that. The benefits then tend to spur population increase, but with increasing population, the benefits also tend to reduce. So here you have a reinforcing feedback loop and a counteracting one. Then this allows two types of behavior broadly. One where first the dominant feedback dominates and the reinforcing feedback dominates, and this leads to rapid growth in the system. And then the other feedback kicks in and you get the collapse. Or they both can balance out and you get a sustainable outcome. And this is also possible, not excluded from the framework. And yeah, this has a lot of there's a lot of depth in this picture, and it can be generalized. So for any society, um, if you can find some dimension of it, some aspect that has to do with specialization, organization at scale. So anything that they invested into a problem-solving endeavor, this is a manifestation of complexity. This is how it's defined in the system. The complexity helps in extracting resources to solve the problems, and this comes with certain returns. If the returns are profitable, then you reinvest in the complexity, and this creates reinforcing feedback. A higher complexity usually comes with higher costs, so it tends to diminish the returns. And this has another instance, several instances actually, um, and that's the Roman Empire. You can think about what's a specialized, organized dimension of them that was relevant, and that was the army. So the army was used to conquer territory, which was essentially the resource, and from there they got certain benefits, which was precious metals, tribute, taxation, all sorts of these things. All of these were then reinvested into the army and the state apparatus, and the feedback went on. The thing is, at some point, you reach a saturation point, and the mechanism doesn't stop. They continue investing, and they debase the currency to the point where they were basically losing out. They would debase the currency to gain a temporary advantage and finance the wars, but then it wasn't enough. They wouldn't win, and the cycle continued. And basically, they gradually lost territory, the currency was devalued, and this manifested in a collapse. This is an interesting, another instance of the general mechanism that I described. So this is more than just a diagram. You can do, again, a model of it that I developed, and you can fit it to data, and it works very well. And the underlying logic in the model is the one I described. So here you have a fit of the land and the silver content, which is of coins, which is a proxy for the benefits they had. And there's a very good fit. And actually, the model is quite simple. It's the harmonic oscillator, and it does a remarkable job fitting the available data. There's one more. It also fits the army size, which actually grows in proportion to territory. And yeah,
Sabin,
yes,
can I interrupt you for one moment
of course,
because I
of course.
think I missed the equations. Did you
Oh,
show the
I didn't put the
equations at
equations
some
here.
point?
No, I didn't put the
Ah,
equations here.
no? Ah, okay,
No,
okay.
no, no,
So
no. You
because
didn't miss anything.
ah,
No, I was just
yeah, but
describing in more general terms. We'll have some equations later.
okay, okay,
Um,
okay. So I
yes,
didn't miss it.
yes. No, no, you didn't miss it. Relax, relax. I was just describing the model in general, but typically I don't include the equations early on because there's a lot of detail in them, and people might get caught up. And there's a much simpler model that captures all the essentials, and I have it a little bit later. I just wanted to give the big picture here. that this whole framework is very consistent and it works both in the quantitative aspect and the conceptual. So there's a good alignment between all of those. Yeah, and what's interesting, the moment you have a model, you can also propose policies to save the empire. So here, if the empire would split in half and have the same policy in their coins, so reduce the silver content to half, and they would do this during the time of Marcus Aurelius, then it's very likely the empire would have survived for much longer than it did. So it gives you a way to have different policy interventions. And sadly, at the time, the Marcus Aurelius's brother died, and yeah, that is sort of a missed opportunity, basically. Yeah. So just to give a broader picture here, um, in understanding the dynamics of these systems, I focused on this very long time scale, basically 1,000 years. And the idea was to find this equivalent of gravity that operates in this over that time scale. You can quantify that effect for these equations, and the equations reflect those feedback mechanisms. So um, the broader picture is at different time scales, you have different forces operating. And at the very short time scales, you have things like individual plans of various fiscal reporting and celebrations and things like this. This is like the 1 year time scale, things that we're used to. At the 10 year time scale, you have economic plans, cycles, and political incentives, like various plans and agendas and things of this sort. At the 100 years time scale, you have dynastic policies. So here, the incentive has to do with legacy. What do kings or different dynasties want to leave behind? Also infrastructure. The time scale is usually around 100 years that is advised, and broader demographic trends. So here, there's a theory by Peter Turchin that he developed and quantified on structural demographic theory. And basically that operates and sort of explains phenomena at this time scale. That has to do with rebellions, revolutions, different demographic trends. Then comes the 1,000 year time scale, which is the one I described. And this covers this equivalent of gravity, these complexity feedbacks that operate over that time scale. Interestingly, also religion is a similar force that operates over a similar time scale. So if you think about Christianity, it took around 1,000 years until it split into Orthodox and Catholic. So if you think about the Romans, again, their whole endeavor of conquering was under the banner of Mars and the god of war. So there's also this connection with religion. It's quite an interesting link. Then at the 10,000 year time scale, there are deeper forces that are sort of characteristic to societies, and they essentially are features of every society. And this is the emergence of power hierarchies and agricultural production. So you always have inequality in some shape or form, and you always have an agrarian state, essentially, ultimately. They all rely on this for food production. At the 100,000 year time scale, you have biological evolution, tool making, and climate effects, like the ice ages. So this is a much the longer the time scales, the harder it is to affect the underlying dynamics. So and essentially they all build on each other. So the longest time scale is the foundation, and then the shorter time scales are built on top. So basically, every institution in the Roman Empire would have never gone counter to their overall military objectives. It was always aligned with that particular policy. It was a common policy for all the emperors and all the rulers. So, yeah, basically everything builds on top of each other, and individual plans follow all these constraints. Same with economic cycles; they have to be consistent with the longer term incentives. So, yeah, this was the big picture on how this dynamic unfolds, and I'll give a specific example. Now, if people have questions now, I'm happy to take it. But if not, we'll leave it to the end. This is a simple model I developed that illustrates the main aspects. So you have here an instance of those variables in terms of population, resources, and returns. And population grows in proportion to wealth per capita, and then there's also a death rate. The resources are agricultural, essentially, and they recover logistically. And you have this extraction of resources that is proportional to population squared. So the population squared is meant to reflect cooperative effects. So you don't typically have this in ecological models, as usually just have the population, um, not the interaction of the population with itself. This is you only have this in predator-prey models, for example. But here, it's meant to illustrate this cooperative effect. Then you have the returns that are derived from the resources, and they also decay over time. Yeah, so this is a very simple model, and I did some interesting things with it. First, the dynamics illustrates the two aspects I said about sustainability and collapse.
Sorry, excuse me.
Yes,
This is
yes,
the part I was waiting for. Can you go back a little bit?
yes, yes,
I have one question. The first
yes,
term, set over X,
yes.
what's the interpretation for it?
Wealth per capita.
Hmm?
Wealth per capita or income per
Wealth
capita.
per capita. Okay, okay,
Yes,
good.
yes, yes, yes. I sorry, I was not clear enough.
And D is like death
Decay,
rate?
decay. Yeah,
Yeah,
decay rate, death
yeah,
rate. Yeah.
yeah, okay, okay. And then why would return be y alpha is in the same is the same alpha in the y for y second and third equation?
So yeah, essentially it would be 100% efficiency, which is not necessarily realistic, but you can just change it with something proportional to it.
Ah, okay, yeah,
Yeah, but
100%
it's not.
efficiency. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I
but
see.
it's yeah, but it's not non-essential, right? You get the same
No, no,
behavior.
no, no.
Not
I was
yeah,
just like curious. I was curious because it's just because it looked like you wanted to have less parameters. But but yeah, yeah, of course it's a sort of yeah, yeah, there are a
yeah.
million ways to solve
Yeah,
this. Yeah.
it's a simplification. Like we're
Yeah,
only looking
yeah.
at the
It is a
resources that.
simplification that is 100% efficiency, and yeah, probably that there are many ways to accommodate this. Yeah, I
Yeah,
see. So we
yeah.
have alpha, how many parameters? A, B, uh, one, two, three,
Six,
four,
seven, six
five,
or seven.
no? And K, yeah,
Yeah, okay, yeah, seven, yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. See. Okay, okay, great. And the X square accounts for like
Operation.
yeah, yeah, like it's not linear the way in which resources are used. If you have more people, then they should be able to do even better use of resources. That's quite an assumption.
Well,
But
not
is well, I mean, it's within a certain extent of community level, maybe it's reasonable, but perhaps for larger communities,
it's probably even more acute, I think, because you do have companies like at the international level or something. Yeah, but in agrarian setting, it's maybe a bit more forced. At the level of a village, for example, you would have this. But then again, you also have the state coordinating the whole taxing and sort
yeah,
of
yeah,
enforcing
yeah, yeah. No,
somehow
no,
on roads.
I follow, I
So,
follow. It's just that there are many caveats like space, you know. This, if you do the
oh
PDE
yeah, yeah,
version,
yeah.
you will
So
have inequality and all that. Are you gonna get there?
yeah, yeah, no, no, no. So actually, yes, in a way, yes, I
Yeah, that's
will.
for the
Yeah,
discussion.
yeah,
Okay, okay.
yes, yes, yes,
Keep
yes,
going.
yes, yes. So that's a very good point. So a lot of these models are mean field, and they're just the aggregate perspective essentially. And as a first step, it's the first step basically when you build the models, and it's the simplest. But then yes, you can add special features, and this is what I'll show next. So this has the two behaviors I mentioned, and the critical parameter is the extraction rate per capita or per interaction. Um, and if that is low, then you get the steady state. If it's too high, then you get limit cycles. So if people are too greedy, then the system can collapse. And this is a common feature that you see also in the East Island model and the Maya model, because they're both agrarian and follow the same pattern. With the Romans, it's different because there it's actually just a linear system, and if you want to save it, you change the value of the stocks, not the value of the parameters. But still, this highlights the main dynamics that you see. You have a bifurcation, and you can compute the point where this happens. Bifurcation again, this explains the transition from this sustainable regime to collapse. And I did something interesting. What if you had multiple regions interacting? So this introduces, let's say, a spatial component. And the way I decided to introduce it is in this specific way, where you have in the extraction term a matrix that basically accounts for the multiple interactions between different regions. And you can see the terms there. There's the usual, let's say, predation term for a specific region extracting its resources, and then you have that multiplied with all these possible interactions with other regions. And this has some surprising behaviors. Specifically, gives you chaos. So if you have a perfectly uniform interaction matrix, then the system synchronizes and all the regions behave the same, assuming they have the same parameterization or the same parameters, the same features. However, if you just slightly modify the diagonal of this matrix, then the system becomes chaotic above a certain extraction rate of resources. So, and here I showed the bifurcation diagram and the attractor, the way it looks like. And what's interesting is the upper exponent that tells you the time, the characterizes the chaotic trajectories. The inverse of it is 280 years. So basically, 180 years, or like up to a few hundred years, you can have predictive dynamics. So two neighboring trajectories would not diverge too much, and this gives you a sort of a horizon of predictability in the system. The smaller the Lyapunov exponent, the less chaotic it is, the longer the time scale that you can predict in the system. But basically, if you go to many thousands of years, then it's no longer predictive. So what is this is meant to highlight that maybe up to 1,000 years, you can have meaningful dynamics, like predictive potential in your different models. But if you go, let's say, to 10,000 years, then the overall pattern of history, the emergence and death of different societies, is a random pattern. They're not random, but chaotic, at least according to this model. So you wouldn't necessarily expect to have a predictive power at that time scale. Now, there's another interesting thing you can do, and this is add migration between the different regions. And here you just have the excess population moving from one region to another in a very sort of simple implementation. And something interesting happens. I took different topologies, and I considered only one of the nodes to be sustainable. So basically have a low extraction rate. And the other nodes to have a higher extraction rate. And I wanted to see if the single node can stabilize the whole network. Somehow if it can take the excess population from everything and be able to balance out. And what's interesting is this does happen. So as you can see here in the right-hand graph, I plot the ratio between the maximum and the minimum populations. So if that ratio is 1, that means you don't have oscillations and the system is stable. So in this case, you see that within a certain region of parameter space, so the diffusion constant is fairly high, then the one node can stabilize the whole network, which is an interesting thing. I also had illustrated this for Easter Island, where if you had two connected islands, then they could stabilize each other. But that was a more limited result. Like it was a specific topology. This is much more general and more robust. And the same happens for different topologies. You just have a different profile of in the region and parameter space where this sustainable outcome can occur. It's quite remarkable that one society can stabilize many others. And yeah, this happens in many contexts. And if you connect two sustainable societies, it actually reduces their strength. They're not more sustainable. It doesn't stabilize the system more, it actually hampers it. So if all of these are separated and they have their own sort of patches where they interact with not unsustainable societies, then that tends to stabilize the network better. And you only need around 20% in the network of scattered nodes that are sustainable to stabilize the whole network. That's more or less the fraction that you need. So this is one outcome. And yeah, you can also interpret these dynamics from economics perspective. The sustainable outcome, you can see it as rational, and the unsustainable one as irrational. And yeah, it gives you a way to quantify what are called sunk costs. So in the sustainable outcome, the marginal benefit and cost equalize. So you basically have an optimal outcome. Whereas in the unsustainable case, the marginal benefit is higher for a long time until the cost and benefits cross, and then the costs become much larger. And this is the decline phase of the society. And what happens is society basically collapses the moment the accumulated benefit and cost equal. So it's not the marginal quantities, but the actual ones. So this is in contrast with economic theory that posits this uh, marginality assumption that rational agents are sensitive to the rates of change. But actually, it seems all these cases of collapse, they're not sensitive to the rate of change. They're sensitive to the overall accumulated amount, which is consistent with sunk costs, which is this fallacy that says your prior investments bias your future decisions. So what it means in these cases is as long as there was some benefit to um, there was still existing in the system that you could use to perpetuate it, then it will be used up until it was all gone. So think about the Roman Empire. It kept going until it lost all its territory. And yeah, it fragmented quite deeply. So yeah, that's more consistent with the history and the behavior, and it gives a way to quantify these sunk costs. Yes, so I'll say some things about modern society because yeah, we're living in it, so might as well. I need to um, contextualize this a little bit. So all the discussion happens in the last 10,000 years, or more 12,000 years, more or less. And you can divide history in different periods depending on the speed of travel. So there's one period up to 3,500 BC. That's I'd call the age of land because most travel was done on foot. So the horses were not domesticated yet, and basically most civilizations did not emerge. They only start appearing after this point. And this is I'd call the age of sea, or the age of stability, where you have this domestication of horses, and it lasted maybe around 5,000 years. And you have most civilizations emerging, and they typically would have a neighboring sea next to them that determine their overall size. So we had Mediterranean for the Roman Empire, the Gulf of Mexico for the Maya, and similarly for other societies. This is like a rule of thumb that gives you the maximum size. And the closer you come to the present day, the larger the correlation length. So in the age of land, for example, you might travel 100 kilometers within a span of a few days, and that was sort of the effective length of how large a system, the social system could grow. If you go to the age of sea, then sea travel would allow you even up to 1,000 kilometers, which is sort of the characteristic size of a lot of these empires. Then you go to the age of oceans, or what they call the age of saturation, because you reach the maximum length scale for the planet, which is 10,000 kilometers. So there's an order of magnitude each time when you go from one age to the next. And this has only accelerated, like the time scale to travel that distance reduced. So it took Magellan a few years, and now you can do it right by plane much faster. So and in this context, it makes sense to since 1500 model the entire world as one system because the time scales are short and it's well mixed. So this um, thinking of it as one aggregate system interacting is it makes sense. And If you want to separate one component, it's very difficult because it has a lot of interactions. Even North Korea, which would say is isolated from the rest, actually has its policies because the interaction with the rest. So there's a long history there. So it's very the first step would be to model the whole system. And there was a study, Limits to Growth, that did this as a first exercise. And again, it's a consistent, sensible thing to do because of these the time skills have reduced for travel. Now, after I mentioned there's that diagram that so we need to apply it to modern society. And for this, the trickiest thing is to understand what is complexity and what way is complexity manifested in the modern world. So for the Romans, there has to be something specialized and organized that's essentially paradigmatic. Like for the Romans, it was the army. And it was like their go-to solution for most problems if they needed extra revenue. So for us, what's the one thing we always go to when we want to solve a problem? It's just a question for the audience, if you're wondering. It's something everyone agrees on. It's global. There's no exception to it, except for very few small communities. Independent of religion, independent of government, independent of everything. Everyone does it. It's like the universal global paradigm, at least currently. So there's no answer from the audience.
But mobility?
Technology.
Yeah.
So technology is the hallmark of complexity in the modern world, as it's specialized, organized, and we use it to solve all our problems. And at least we try to. And yeah, it's our go-to solution, and it's arguably sort of the equivalent for our society of what was the army for the Romans. And historically, fossil fuels were the main resource that fueled it, and that technology allowed the extraction of, like the steam engine and all these things. The main benefit is a modern lifestyle, which is very much comparable to kings of the past. So even ice cream, you're privileged to in the days of old to have it. And because of this lifestyle improvement, we very much invest in technology. And you can see it in every political discourse, and there's in every grant application, everything. Like it is ubiquitous, and there's virtually no exception in the industrial world when it comes to almost worshiping it. So there's a few layers to this paradigm. First came humanism, so places mankind at the center of the universe. Then came technology as the highest expression of that creativity. And then came economic growth, which was permitted by the material expansion. And when economic growth sort of malfunctions, you have debt, which is another part of the paradigm. So these add on each other, and the hallmark is essentially technology. And yeah, and if there would be a collapse, this would unfold in reverse order. So the first problems you see would be in the financial system, similar to 2008. Then you see a slowdown in economic growth. Then eventually, after many decades, probably hundreds of years, you'd see some techno-skepticism cropping again. But that's very far off, yeah, as of yet. Now, the key resource I mentioned in the slide were fossil fuels. They were like the main driver and the main energy source we're still using to fuel our industrial society. And most important of them is oil. So back in '98, this was a publication in Scientific American by two geologists that showed oil production. And you can see by today, we should have quite a significant reduction compared to the peak. The peak should be in the early 2000s, and then things should start decreasing. This graph actually is quite accurate when it comes to conventional oil production. And we reached the maximum production around the mid 2000s, 2006, 2008, something along those points. This is in terms of conventional oil production, which historically has been very beneficial. It has had a very high energy return on investment. So It allowed us to have economic growth and not basically worry about if there was any inefficiency in the system. Nature gave us enough free lunches to correct them. So it was a very good time in that regard. Since that point, around 2010, um, you can see here a massive increase in investments uh, in both conventional and non-conventional production. So you see in the lower graph, investments go from around 100 billion dollars per year in conventional production to 400 billion for the 2010s. And similarly with unconventional production. So these are another 100, 200 billion there. So it went from 100 billion investment to 500, 600 billion. This is an enormous amount of money that was invested. And essentially what it means, the production hasn't decreased as much. So conventional production remains flat. And basically, we're essentially in that region of the Roman Empire where they're forcing uh, they're debasing their currency to maintain their expansion. So in a way, we're doing the same with unconventional production and also trying to keep conventional production going. Investments was huge, and we're hoping it pays off, but it hasn't yet. So there's one question. I'll take it now.
Thank you. I have a question about a previous graph. Could you please? Yeah, I have a question particularly for UK and Norway. I'm not really good in economics, but I know that in Norway there's very special politics and oil history. And I wanted to ask you why UK and Norway in this graph are together, by which principle, by which pattern?
Because it's North Sea, there is the same extraction field. So you usually make these graphs based on the field that you're extracting. So if it's a common field, then it makes sense to put them together. You could separate them, but from a geological perspective, it doesn't make sense. It's only political. From a geological perspective, you're doing the same operation, just the money goes in different, the production goes in different ways. But the actual output
Okay.
from the ground is from one field. It's like from one area, and it's more consistent to model it as such because that determines the outflow. Then the outflow would be similar for the same region. So this is why I think they were put together there.
Okay, but why not Sweden, for example? And about Norway, I know that they found the oil and they became rich because they were pretty poor a very long time. And then they became actually a rich country only because they found oil in their country. And so if it's the same region, then how it's historically can be combined with UK? And if you say that it's just a North region, why then Sweden or Finland not included?
No. I'm not saying about the region of the countries. I'm saying the
Yeah,
region of extraction of oil, which is the North
yeah,
Sea.
exactly. North Sea. Okay,
The North
okay.
Sea. No,
Okay,
not Scandinavia. No,
okay,
nothing to
okay,
do with
okay, okay, okay,
Scandinavia. The North Sea.
okay.
North Sea is
I
common
see.
between the UK and Norway. So we
Okay.
both extract from the same region. There was the region of
Yeah,
extraction, not the countries.
but they did it in different times, no?
Uh, well, they both
Norway
kind of
was
started in
later.
yeah, but it's the same mm, domain, the same field, maybe a decade separation. But
Okay,
yeah, that's not really that relevant. It's kind of the same.
okay. It's just
So
because here in the graph you have precisely decades, and I thought that Norway was pretty later than UK, so I'm a bit
yeah,
surprised.
but
Okay.
it doesn't change the profile of production from the overall mm, mm, field. Because I
Mhm.
mean, if it was just one country, maybe it extracted the part and then expanded later. So it's the same thing. It doesn't really alter the overall profile.
Okay, thank you.
And the same goes for the entire world, because you can add up all these graphs and they all give this a similar shape. As you can see, they all behave in a similar way. And
Hmm.
they're essentially Gaussians. So if you
Hmm.
add them all up, you get a bigger Gaussian, like the theorem in mathematics. And
Hmm.
there's some perturbations here because there was some political instability like in the 70s with OPEC and all these things. But
Hmm.
generally, as long as you have political stability, you get a very nice, uniform, symmetric graph, at least for the conventional oil production.
Yeah, I
So
understand. Also, just former Soviet Union, it's also a tricky combination because if you take 15 republics, then not all of them produced oil, and the distribution of the oil which is produced in Russia is very, very different from, for example, in Belarus or Ukraine or Kazakhstan. So it's also not really, you know, how to say, homogeneous. So, but
yeah,
I
but
think I will check the. Sorry, I won't take your time for this question. I will check the source, and we'll read more about it. Sorry, but thank
yeah,
you
yeah,
very
yeah.
much for the
So
explanation.
yeah. So everything you say is yeah accurate probably with all the different countries and stuff. The thing is there are only very few big producers. You have the smaller countries, they might have some peculiarities that would alter a little bit the overall profile of the curve, but not much. So it wouldn't change the big picture. It will pretty much remain the same. So yeah, you
Yeah,
can
I understand, but when you say former Soviet Union, you mean 15 countries. And this is a pretty, it's another context when you just say Russia, for example, so that's
yeah.
why I'm curious.
So they included this, but again, it's the same example with the UK and Norway. Like there was
Yeah, yeah.
whatever regions they were extracting probably from the Caucasian Mountains. Yeah, it's um, even if you take individual efforts, there is still a curve of a similar profile. So if you just add them up, they still look the same. It doesn't really
Hmm.
alter it. This is the nice
Yeah.
thing about this profile production. As long as the curves look the same, it doesn't matter if you add them up because it's just like one bigger country or like cooperative union that was doing the same thing. So you could even substitute, but it's just matter of proximity to the resource, essentially. That's maybe the only would matter.
Hmm. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
So
I will read. Thank you.
yeah, there's a big literature on this, and yeah, this is a good starting point. Yeah. So where does that leave us? Basically, we have the production now of oil globally, at least conventional one, the highly profitable one, is flat, which means we have problems economically. We're not growing anymore. So we had a debt crisis back in 2008, and then what follows is a slowdown in economic growth. That would be the next step. And we challenge that paradigm. And here I included a graph for the US, where you have net production of electricity and overall energy consumption. And as you can see in the US, you had a steady growth of electricity production up to 2010, and then it's essentially flat. So, um, which means in real terms, there wasn't increased economic activity essentially. There might be an increased financial activity. So you're printing money, you're doing all sorts of Wall Street games, but in the real terms, nothing is happening, and that means you have a problem. You have increased social tensions without economic growth, genuine economic growth. You don't have social mobility. Without social mobility, you tend to have social conflict. You have conflicts, emerging polarization. People are unhappy, and you see this manifesting basically over the 2010s up to the present. And yeah, this is where we find ourselves in. We're basically not growing anymore, more or less, and there's no excess energy to fuel our continued growth. So yeah, it's not a pretty spot to be in. But yeah, I thought I would give the update for modern society. Um, anyway, I have a few publications that summarize these perspectives. So there's my thesis, there's this article that explains the model that I showed. It's published in plus one. There's one on the long-term feedback mechanism underlying collapse that goes into the detail about this feedback mechanisms, and also have one on modeling and sort of what are sort of like good practices in it. Yes, so that's pretty much the overall perspective. I didn't want to end on a gloomy note, but yeah, I wanted to say things of interest for modern times. So that's about it on my side. So if you have any questions, any criticism, anything of the sort, I'm more than welcome, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Floor, will you direct the question round?
Yeah, thank you a lot, Sabin, for your interesting talk. Yeah,
Thanks.
does anyone have a question, a burning question that they want to start off with?
I have a couple, but let's the group to ask first.
Fabricio.
Yeah, hello. First of all, thank you for this presentation. And I have two questions for Mr. Sabin Roman. I saw in one of the last part of the presentation that you got the Lyapunov coefficients for your modeling.
Yeah.
I saw that you got 3.6 times 10 to the minus 3,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Well, my question is, how do you interpret the Lyapunov coefficients you obtain in terms of the predictability and stability on the historical system you are modeling?
So it's a matter of what the Lyapunov exponent means. It means to what extent the trajectories diverge. So the smaller the exponent, the less the divergence. So basically, let's say you have an idea about how society is going to develop over decades, but the society is very stable, like then there are no wars, there are no conflicts with neighbors, there's nothing of this sort. In that scenario, you'd expect the characteristic Lyapunov exponent to be small, because there wouldn't be many things that, if something unexpected would happen, then the trajectory wouldn't be perturbed too much, according given the initial prediction. So if, however, you have this very unstable case where there's sort of like frantic production of different things and maybe conflicts and all sorts of, then obviously the prediction horizon is much smaller, and the situation, whatever event would happen, this could completely alter the trajectory. So in that case, you have a much larger exponent. This is why I interpret the Lyapunov exponent as a way to think about the prediction horizon, because the inverse gives you basically the characteristic time scale that you'd expect a given prediction to hold. Anything beyond that point would likely diverge too much. So yeah, this is the general idea. Like whatever perturbations would happen from the initial state, you don't expect them to be too significant over a few hundred years. But beyond that point, they can alter the trajectory significantly. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Then, as you said, we can assure that the Lyapunov exponent you got means that we had a asymptotical stable or some.
Well, it's a chaotic attractor. It's a chaotic attractor. So there's no. I mean, it's I would say stable, but you don't really. I mean, you think about nodes, right, as stable or unstable, and sinks or saddles. But in this case, the overall trajectory in the bigger space is just chaotic. So there might be regions where, like for a certain time horizon, you can sort of have a prediction, and it might look like a limit cycle, for example, like you'd have here, like one cycle of this. But then in the long term, you don't know where you end up. You can oscillate in at any distance, so you don't know what's going to happen. You do know as long as one cycle is concerned, but you don't know for the next cycle where you end up. How large is going to be, or how small. Yeah, so that's will be the more intuitive picture.
Okay, excellent. And my second one is, what are the main limitations you have encountered when applying dynamic system model to complex economics historical events, because we're considering the influence of non-linear factors such as human decisions and a sort of, yeah.
So you're saying in what way different human decisions?
What are the main limitations you have encountered on
Oh,
a
the main
project
limitations
system in
of
economic historical events?
so what are the limitations of this framework, or is that correct?
Yeah, the
I'm not.
limitation is that there are human decisions to take action in these historical and economic events, and well, for non-linear factors, difficult to represent them.
Yes, yes, yes. So the key here was this separation of time skills that I mentioned. This allows you to do all of science, basically. This is why you have physics, biology, chemistry. We have different phenomena for different regimes of behavior of the natural phenomena. And this same similar separation occurs in human society. So basically, all the decisions and plans people make, no matter how outlandish or revolutionary they might be, they're still in the bounds of that social fabric. So most decisions will always be aligned with broader economic forces or political incentives. Um, there will be some exceptions, and then you can have a revolution. And this does happen, but it only happens at sort of timescales of around 100 years. It doesn't happen that much more often. So um, the yeah, you can take the U.S., the Civil War, and current polarization and tendencies. So the human decision does matter, but it only factors in depending on the time scale. So most will be conforming to these broader forces, and some will ultimately change them. But the way they happen, the way they get affected, has a certain structure. It's not that chaotic. So if you just have Napoleon wants to conquer Europe, you might make a big fuss for a few years, but then everything goes back to normal. So it's not the in our cultural mindset, you can have these figures that are very prominent, and we make a big deal of them. And they feel like, oh, they influence all of history. But no, actually, in most regards, there was a perturbation, and then everything went back to the main agenda, which depends on the society. For example, with the Roman Empire, you had the Augustine plague, and this lasted for around 15 years, and it was a perturbation. But the way they treated that plague was the exact same way we treated the pandemic. So the way basically we're doing everything in our power to go back to normal. So the same went with the Romans. It was a major perturbation, but their main incentive was to continue what they were doing with their conquest and all these things. So the long-term force, the gravity, doesn't change. It's always there and it's always acting. And it's the only thing that matters in the long term. Everything else is just a perturbation. It affects a certain time scale, but much smaller. So the same goes with human decisions. Very few things will go counter to these long-term forces.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question, Fabricio. It's now 5. I don't know, Sabin, if you have some more time for questions, and if the others.
Yeah,
also
I do.
want to-
If people want to ask, I'm still available.
I just have a couple of very short questions, maybe for further discussion.
Mhm.
I'm quite interested in your ideas and modeling, so maybe we could catch up later on. And now I recall that you met Flor at the A Live conference.
My
So
former supervisor, Seth Bullock, met her, and he told her
okay,
about
okay.
our work, and then she contacted me, and hence I'm here.
Yeah. So maybe we will meet up at next A Live or at one of
Yeah,
the A Lives.
I'm thinking of coming.
Yeah,
Yes.
cool. Yeah, so just wanted to ask you these two things so you can elaborate briefly. First, how did you find the parameters for the equations, for the constants? Are these values constant numbers or
Mhm.
are they time dependent? That's the first. because obviously if they are time dependent, then you have too much freedom to claim anything. So I just wanted to confirm that. And second, three questions. How would you interpret the relationships between these parameters? Because you probably fitted many societies, so maybe you can find some relationships between the parameters that will explain, maybe characterize societies in terms of few indexes. And the third question, sorry, that's the third, is have you tried nested versions of this model? So, so you have because of course you got all these timescales, so you could have a model that have nested versions of the model, like defining the major variables as averages or something of the small variables at the smaller scale, and then get a multi-level model.
Yeah, those are very nice, good questions. Thank you. So the parameters are indeed constant. Otherwise, having time-dependent parameters, basically you're controlling the system, essentially, all exogenous. So no, everything is completely endogenized, and the dynamics, the parameters are constants. And the way I found them was I did what, as I said, I had a model structure, and I took the parameters from the literature. So the Easter Island one had the same parameters as the original Brander and Taylor paper by the economists. And I took the same parameterization, I put it in a different model structure, and I got a very good fit. So this is a strong argument in favor of the new model structure.
Yeah, I missed that part. Yeah.
Yes. I mean,
But
there was a
how
lot that I
come you
mentioned.
get all these parameters? I mean, alpha. How do you get alpha for Easter Island?
Oh, they estimated. So the economist estimated it, and I used a very similar value, and it gives this a very good fit. And the fit only works for a parameter value that's above the critical threshold. So you get oscillations and you get collapse. So and the same for for the Maya. Again, there were like 15 parameters there. They're all from very well justified from the literature, and one of the key aspects there was the maximum number of times that you could harvest the land before the soil is depleted. And that I found from agricultural survey of different lands in the US that said that even for the best soil, you can do it up a maximum of 7 times. And that's a very specific number that I put exactly in the model with that value, and it works very well for the Yucatan. So all the parameters, it's a very tricky thing, like just reading things from a lot of different fields and somehow having all work together in the model with no fiddling. Like there's no fine tuning, there's nothing. It's more or less what I read in the literature, that's what I put in the model. Like, and somehow the structure needs to be the one that that works. So there's no optimization. It's optimization in the space of models, not in the space of parameters. So and then regarding the last question,
the nestedness.
Nestedness, yes. So here, because I'm working on the largest time scale, and it's all aggregates, there's only one level, right? There's no, if you go to multiple levels, for example, the 100-year time scale, where you have rebellions and all sorts of things, then yes, you need a nested structure. You need to account for the long-term pattern. And then inside of that, have additional dynamics. So I actually did this and for colonial empires. There's this a paper that goes through most empires in history and shows that their growth curve is a logistic one, but they don't account for the collapse, for the decline. So what I did is I took this equation that describes the growth, and I added the carrying capacity as a control parameter. And with the right choice of, uh, of objective, you can sort of build in Hamiltonian and have sort of control engineering approach to it. And overall, doing all of that, you're basically building a nested structure. You have the default behavior that you'd expect, like logistic growth. And on top of that, you have other variables that you're controlling. So you're building an additional dynamic on top of it. And the emergent dynamics actually fits the entire profile. So you have both the increase and the collapse. So the same approach would go here. You'd have a baseline that's set by by the dynamics at the time scale, for example, 1,000 years. And on top of that, you'd have different dynasties, for example, or different political regimes, you'd have different incentives and different control structures within the structure, and the difference in the different substructures in the broader structure. And basically, if you're optimizing for that, then you get different emergent behavior at the short term. And this is really, it's very tricky. Like, it's not obvious what would be the adequate controls to represent the incentives people or countries have. So the economists usually start from the individual and think everything builds up in the aggregate from individual desires and drives. But it's more actually the opposite. You have huge institutional constraints and forces that actually set much broader agendas. And those form the baseline behavior. And on top of that, you have additional optimization and different control structures. But this is basically this nestedness that you mentioned comes in the different timescales and control mechanisms. They're all different at different timescales. So the individual plans only come at the shortest timescale, and that would be just the very last nest, the very last layer in the modeling. So yeah, it's a very involved thing to answer, but basically you can do it. There's just it's very non-trivial. It's very non-trivial, and it goes essentially counter to what most economists thought about in terms of utility functions. It's not individual, they're group, and they tend to be emergent. So you don't really know what you're doing until it happens, essentially.
Yeah.
But you are following certain incentives and things. It's just they're often unconscious, or
Yeah.
they follow. Yeah. So yeah, so it's possible to do that. It's very tricky. So I managed to do it for these colonial empires and that followed this. But in general, yeah, it's quite formidable. So, but it would be nice if the economists would update their methodology and account for all these things. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Understood.
Are there any more questions? Or maybe reflections?
Okay. So anyways, I will share this talk to someone that is a member of the group that has worked in similar stuff. I think he will be interested. And are you aware of the multi-level selection theory by David Sloan Wilson?
I might
No?
be,
Okay.
I might be, but the name doesn't ring a bell. So
Probably, yeah, because this could be a good formalization. It's a paradigm that he has put in biology and also in economics, and the nested version of your model, which yeah, we also have some methods to do this type of modeling, but never tried with the civilizations and your data basically. We never tried. But yeah, I will send these sources. But yeah, this person will have to check your seminar first and then maybe you come back. But I will send you up an article so you can check it out.
that's
A couple of
wonderful.
things. Okay,
So
that's on my
I'd
side.
be happy to collaborate. I'd be happy to talk, to explain if he needs a direct encounter. And also the framework I mentioned does apply to ecology as well. Because complexity, resources, returns,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's just a different setting, but same concepts.
Mhm.
All right, so that was it on a little comment.
So great.
Yeah, okay. Then with that, I would really like to thank you, Sabin, for wanting to give this seminar for